Last month, I found myself in a strange situation, sitting in a large room surrounded by over 100 psychiatrists, listening to a presentation in a language I did not understand. This was the Swedish Congress of Psychiatry annual conference, where I was invited to do a keynote talk. Due to the language barrier, my attempt to grasp the current zeitgeist in psychiatry had limited success, but there were some English language talks. I was able to do some translation, and I did speak to some individual psychiatrists. So I'd like to outline what I learned about modern psychiatry, especially given attempts of philosophers of psychiatry, advocates and detractors of expert by experience research, and advocates and detractors of self-diagnosis to understand what is occurring within modern psychiatry. The actual journey to Stockholm was quite an undertaking. I have decided to stop flying for environmental reasons, or at least any flights I will take will be a major exception. So I had to get to Stockholm through a combination of trains and ferries. Conveniently, there was a 3-day workshop in Aarhus, which I was attending, so this broke up the journey. Avoiding flying meant a train from Lancaster to Newcastle, overnight ferry to Amsterdam, train to Hamburg, next day train to Aarhus, train to Malmö, and next day train to Stockholm. Getting back was an overnight train from Stockholm to Hamburg, train to Amsterdam, overnight ferry to Newcastle, and then a train to Lancaster. This took a lot longer than flying, but used up a lot less emissions as far as I can tell, and was a lot more comfy. As a philosopher of psychiatry, I am somewhat of an outsider to psychiatry itself. I lack data upon exactly what views psychiatrists hold. A possible exception is in relation to their views about psychiatric diagnoses and the alternatives to psychiatric diagnoses, whereby I hopefully have some understanding of this. However, I feel I could do with a much better understanding of what goes on daily within psychiatric assessments and within more empirically orientated psychiatric research. This is especially relevant for my interest in self-diagnosis and expert by experience research. I often find that advocates of these have quite a strong view about what occurs in diagnostic consultations and psychiatric research, and advocates often feel confident about what psychiatrists know and what psychiatrists think is relevant. Similarly, detractors of these also seem to feel quite confident about what is occurring. So one of my hopes was to get an understanding of what psychiatrists think during my 3 days at the conference. I knew before I arrived that most talks are in Swedish, but there were some talks with an English title, so I was hoping to understand 10 or so talks. However, it turned out that about half of the talks with an English title were actually in Swedish. But I did learn something from one of the Swedish talks, and I learned things from the English talks and the response to my own talk. The conference began after a slightly bizarre situation where a classic ensemble introduced things. Never seen this at a philosophy conference before, with a presentation in the main hall. Whilst this presentation was in Swedish, I think it was intended as an introduction to set the tone for the entire conference. 2 phrases kept coming up: humanism and person-centered. My understanding of humanism is that it is an ethical system that values the individual agency of individual people, while person-centered means focusing on people as individuals. So this individual presentation was about an ethical and epistemological focus on the individual. This did not seem to fit common criticisms of psychiatrists as just focusing upon curing or managing disorders. There was a series of talks in English about schizophrenia, antipsychotics, and physical health problems. They were discussing the link between cardiovascular risk and antipsychotics, whereby mechanistically there seems to be a link between medication and heart problems, but it also turns out that schizophrenic people who take antipsychotic medication live longer. I cannot comment upon the methodologies employed in these presentations and the evidence they offered, but it does once again suggest that psychiatrists are taking a much broader account of people's well-being than just focusing upon removing disorders or managing disorders. There was a keynote presentation about how names of diagnoses related to treatment. Specifically, it related to the diagnosis of treatment-resistant depression. The speaker, who was a psychiatrist, pointed out that telling someone that their depression is treatment-resistant through a diagnostic label is not exactly the best thing for their psychological health. There are gentler ways to tell someone that none of the medications are currently working and we're not optimistic about the next medication we're going to try. There was also a lot of interesting content about how people can change diagnoses over time. such as moving from treatment resistant to non-treatment resistant as their life situation changes, and also how treatment resistant is itself quite a heterogeneous term, covering varying degrees of responses to medications. This shows a level of awareness of the views and wider well-being of people who receive diagnoses, as well as more sophisticated views about treatment other than just whether the disorder has been removed or not. I especially liked the idea that the diagnosis someone can get can change over time due to environmental changes, something that I argued for in relation to autism, or more specifically changing subtypes, in my paper on the history of childhood schizophrenia. Finally, my presentation on defending psychiatric diagnosis seemed to be well received. Whether you think this is a good or bad thing likely depends upon what you think the quality of my work is, but it does suggest that some psychiatrists are willing to listen to a more philosophical side of the debate. Overall, I felt things were generally at a higher level of sophistication compared to how advocates of self-diagnosis and expert by experience research seem to portray psychiatrists. This is not to suggest that psychiatrists broadly hold good views. That is a separate question, only that there are higher degrees of sophistication compared to what some critics often claim. Obviously, I only saw a small number of psychiatrists discuss a small number of issues, and all this took place in one particular conference which occurred in one particular country. Additionally, if psychiatrists today do hold more sophisticated views, this potentially might be due to their critics highlighting a lot of these problems. Anyway, I hope they've given some interesting information about what I came across at the conference. Thank you for listening.